Welcome to Philosophy 4, Knowledge at Las Positas College. We've finished now talking about these historical approaches to questions of knowledge. We've made our way from ancient Greece up into the modern period. And now we're going to be talking about philosophers who are largely still active in universities around the world. These philosophers are responding to a lot of the same problems as the ancient philosophers, but we'll see them responding to these questions in more contemporary ways. Our first reading will be on Foundationalism and Coherence. You'll find this in your Moser textbook on pages 380 to 387. In fact, the essay goes longer than this, but the key elements we need to analyze from Foundationalism and Coherence as theories comes in this first 8 pages of the essay. So to start thinking about how argumentative structure works in general from a modern perspective, I'm going to define 4 terms for you here that are often thought to make up the bedrock of a justified claim. Then I'm going to illustrate how these work with an example. So contemporary philosophers talk about premises as evidence given for a claim. The conclusion is the claim itself that's being justified by our evidence. Warrant is the explanation for why the premises justify the conclusion. And an argument will often also need justification for the premises themselves. Why should the premises be accepted as true? So here's a quick example of a claim. The claim is education is good for you. Now if we want to justify this claim, we might give premise or evidence. Why is education good for you? Education is good for you because it gets you more money. Now if I want to evaluate this argument or ask if it's justified, there are 2 questions I could ask. One is, if the premise is true, does it really support the claim? And this, as we saw, is the question of warrant. So if I tried to offer warrant for this argument, in other words, why is it that the fact that education gets you more money supports the claim that education is good for you? Well, maybe we need some kind of a bridging premise here. And we might say something like, money helps you survive. And that would be a decent start for a warrant or justification for why the fact that education gives you more money means education is good for you. But warrant assumes that the premise is true and asks, if the premise is true, how does it justify the claim? But we could also ask for justification for the premise. And it turns out that there are, in fact, many studies that have been done on the relative earning power of educational attainments. And it turns out that the more education you have, the more likely you are to earn more money. Now you can see this way of looking at an argument also gives me places where I can rationally challenge an argument to see how good the argument is. I could, for example, go to the warrant and say, well, if it's true that money helps you survive, is that the only thing that helps you survive? Or is education the only way to get money? Or if I wanted to question whether or not education actually provides you more money, I might look at examples of people who have made a lot of money with less education, even though those examples might go against averages. Now this is a solid way to think about premises and justification within an argument, but as we saw earlier in this course, it also raises certain problems. I may need to give further justification and warrant to make sure my argument is justified, and I may need continuously further premises to support my conclusion. So looking at our example so far, we said, okay, education is good for you. There's a claim. Why is it good for you? Education gets you more money. But how do we know education gets you more money? Well, I've read study X, Y, and Z. There's a study that comes out from Georgetown every year using data from the US Census to compare income relative to education level. But how do I know these are good studies? Well, the studies are in peer-reviewed journals with good methodologies. Okay, well, how do you know that these are peer-reviewed journals with good methodology? Well, I actually went through and read the methodology in these studies. But then if someone was to ask, how do you know that you read the methodology in the studies? There's not a ton more for me to say. Well, yes, it was in front of my eyes. I saw it. It was my experience. I did, in fact, read it. But then let's assume someone continues to press for justification, sounding more like a skeptic now. Well, are you sure it was in front of your eyes? Yes, I read it. It was in front of my eyes. And in the end, it looks like my argument is going to boil down to something like, I trust my senses in normal circumstances. If you see it, and nothing's messing with your vision, what you see is reliable. And we remember from Sextus the problem of the circular argument and hypothesis, where something is just asserted as true, and we can't further justify that claim without basically just restating it. I trust my senses because they're reliable. How do you know they're reliable? Because they've been trustworthy. How do you know they were trustworthy? Because they were reliable. And it looks like I've just gone as far as I can go in this process of justification. Now we will remember this discussion at the beginning of class about why should I care if my beliefs are justified? The key point is that knowledge requires justified true belief. True belief in itself is not sufficient. Imagine, for example, that someone on the freeway was holding a sign that said, "The world will end tomorrow." And it turned out that, in fact, the next day the world ended. We probably wouldn't be willing to say that person knew the world was ending. We would just say, well, that person believed the world was ending, and it just so happened that someone in a nuclear developed country pressed the button on that day. A few years ago, we went through an unexpected and massive decline in housing values that caused a recession. And people sought out those thinkers who had claimed that a housing crisis was on its way. Some of those people believed a housing crisis was coming for reasons that were entirely unjustified. We probably would not say those people actually knew that housing values were going to decline, and most philosophers would agree that a belief is knowledge only if I believe it, it is true, and I have a good reason to believe it. Of course, the skeptical problem, going all the way back to Sextus Empiricus, is just when does the process of justification stop? And Sextus, you remember, is going to say, really, I have only two choices if someone keeps pressing me for justification of my claim. Sextus said this will end in the person claiming to know having to choose between two choices. Choice number one, regress ad infinitum, where the skeptic keeps asking me, how do you know, how do you know, how do you know, until at some point I just give up on the quest of providing justification. Or there's hypothesis. If at some point when the skeptic says, how do you know, I just say, I just do know, I don't want to justify it, I don't have to justify it, this just is, then I have created what Sextus calls an hypothesis. But Sextus will say, well, if you gave up on justification, regress ad infinitum, then you never really justified your claim. Or if you create an hypothesis, the hypothesis is by definition something that you claim to know without any evidence, and so why should I believe that either? And therefore, Sextus will say, we should suspend judgment on all knowledge claims and just live in peace and serenity. Now in Stosa's essay, he talks about foundationalism. Foundationalism is the view that all beliefs depend on some foundational beliefs that are not themselves justified by further beliefs. And Stosa describes this foundationalist view by saying beliefs are like a pyramid. We have these core essential beliefs, the foundational beliefs, that support all the rest of my knowledge, including specific claims. Maybe a core belief is something like, you can trust your senses. And then up near the top is an individual claim, like I read the methodology of this particular study, and I saw it with my own eyes. The core beliefs justify everything that's above it. You can see that in terms of my number of beliefs, it's more like an inverted pyramid, right? because I have a few core beliefs like I can trust my senses, and then all my other beliefs that are more and more specific are justified by a single belief or a small set of beliefs. Stosa uses the idea of the pyramid, I think, because the core beliefs are intended to be the most stable. They're foundational, and they give justification to all those beliefs that are above. So why does foundationalism defeat the infinite regress? Well, it's because justification for my belief stops at my foundational belief. So my belief justification is not going to go on forever. It has a stopping point. Of course, the stopping point looks a lot like what Sextus would call hypothesis. So what are the main arguments for foundationalism? Well, one of the key arguments, as Stosa discusses, is justification must stop somewhere. An infinite justification is either impossible to complete or ineffective as support, and so what's left to us conceptually but some foundationalist claim? What is it that makes foundationalist claims appropriate? Maybe they're self-justifying. I think, therefore I am, from Descartes, maybe that just justifies itself. Maybe it doesn't need justification, or maybe it's justified in some unique way, like by certain mental states or certain external realities, instead of by further beliefs. Now, as Stosa will discuss, most traditional foundationalists have been either rationalists or empiricists. A rationalist foundationalist is going to say that the ultimate justification for our knowledge comes from self-evident mental proofs. Descartes is an example of this, right? Descartes' foundational belief was, I think, therefore I am. If you can have the thought, Descartes said, it can be at the base of your pyramid. From there he derived the idea that only a perfect God could put the idea of perfection in his head, and that such a perfect God would make the world knowable. The empiricist foundationalist, on the other hand, will say that the ultimate justification for our knowledge comes from basic facts given in experience. An example of this is John Locke. You remember that John Locke said that my mind is completely empty before experience of myself and experience of the world provides in all I know to become the foundation of knowledge. In a few weeks, we'll look at the verificationists, who claim that the only evidence of any statement must reduce down to the data given by my senses that verifies that statement. As Stosa points out, foundationalism can also be a theory in ethics. Utilitarians, for example, will claim that the ultimate basis of all ethical judgments is a foundational claim. That foundational claim is that increasing pleasure and happiness is good, while causing pain and suffering is bad. If you ask a utilitarian, why is pleasure good and suffering bad? The utilitarian will just say, this doesn't need further justification. It's self-justifying and the foundation of all further ethical claims. Divine command theory is sometimes used as a foundational ethical theory as well, which just says that right and wrong are decided by whatever God decides. If you ask this foundationalist a further question about why whatever God decides is right is in fact right, they will just repeat to you that God is the one who decides. Now we saw that foundationalism is at least an answer to regress ad infinitum, because there is an end to justification, and justification therefore will not go on forever. But we also saw that hypothesis can act as a counter-argument to the foundationalist claim. Sextus can still come back and say, well, you have some belief that's not justified by any other belief, and if it's not justified, you can't give reasons for why it's true, why do you believe it? And if a philosopher has made a commitment not to accept any claim without justification, this creates a real problem. Another argument made against foundationalism is just the difficulty of inference to the rest of my beliefs from some foundational belief. It's usually very hard to show how I can use my foundational belief to justify the rest of my beliefs. We saw that Descartes uses I think, therefore I am as a foundational claim, but is that foundational claim, as the one thing he can know for certain, enough to establish the things that he wants to conclude from it? You remember that something like the existence of the evil genius meant that he could doubt things like his rationality and his memory, and so it looks like he ends up assuming much more than this foundational truth to get all the way to the idea that a perfect God exists who would make the world knowable. A similar issue exists for Locke's belief about substance. Remember, Locke says, all knowledge is based on the possibility of observation with the senses, but Locke also believes in substance. And so getting from that foundational core belief that the senses provide us information about the world to the claim about substance required a rationalist argument in addition to that foundational claim. So some empiricists claim that Locke wasn't a thorough empiricist because he admits himself that all we can observe with the senses is attributes like shape, texture, and movement, but that there must be something beyond that, which is the substance. Still, getting to the idea that there must be a substance requires more than we get within the properties that we can observe. Therefore, moving from Locke's foundational claim that observation tells us everything about the world to the idea of substance requires a leap, which seems to go beyond what he allows himself in his foundational claim. So I hope this lecture helped you to understand the basics of how arguments and justification are thought of in a contemporary context. I hope that helped to contextualize the arguments of philosophers like Sextus Empiricus within the modern perspective. And I hope this showed you as well how foundationalism is seen as a potential answer to regress ad infinitum, although foundationalism itself has encountered certain challenges.